Good day. Today is Monday, 24th February 2025. It is the third anniversary of the commencement of Russia's special military operation, and it begins, this anniversary is being commemorated in the West by a row which is not being conducted entirely in public, but which is being widely reported upon. Briefly, Ukraine and the European powers, the European states, have come together and proposed a joint statement, a joint resolution to be put before the General Assembly in the United Nations, and they also have been trying to get a separate joint statement published by the G7 states. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians want that statement to criticize the Russians, to refer to the conflict in Ukraine as a war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. Of course, previous statements and resolutions cobbled together by the Western powers, whether at the G7 or the United Nations or wherever else they could present them, have made similar claims. The Western powers, as the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov discussed recently at a G20 meeting in Johannesburg, have also at various times tried to do the same thing at the G20 meetings. They tried to do that at the G20 meeting in Delhi, New Delhi. In 2023, they tried to do the same at the G20 meeting in Brasilia, which I principally remember for the ghostly attendance of President Biden, then in the last weeks of his presidency. But in neither case, neither at the G20 nor neither at the Delhi meeting of the G20 nor at the Brasilia meeting of the G20 were the Western powers fully successful in getting, at all successful actually, in getting the formulations that they wanted approved by the other G20 states. However, at those G20 meetings, the Western powers did act in unison. They did act together. Well, now that is no longer the case. In fact, as I understand it, the situation has become so bad that the United States is actually proposing its own resolution distinct from that of the Ukrainians and the Europeans, and in place of it, which it is threatening to put before the General Assembly. And reports say that the United States has tried to persuade Ukraine to withdraw its draft resolution, which the Zelensky government, backed by the Europeans, is refusing to do. The Russians have suggested to the Americans that the American draft resolution be amended. The American draft resolution apparently is neutral about the responsibility for the war. It laments the fact that the war is continuing. It supports peace efforts. It seeks, in other words, to move the process on according to Donald Trump's ideas of achieving peace. The Russians apparently want to insert into this resolution, which they've hinted they might support, a provision that in order to achieve peace in Ukraine, a settlement in Ukraine, there should be a resolution of the root causes of the conflict. Now, of course, the Russians have discussed in many places what they mean by that. They talk about the fact that Ukraine cannot be a member of NATO. They've made it very clear that they have always and consistently objected to proposals, to suggestions that Ukraine join NATO. They were adamantly opposed to the decision at the Bucharest summit in 2008 to basically persuade the Ukrainians to make an application to join NATO. At that time, as I remember, the Ukrainians, led by the Orange Revolution government of President Yushchenko, was seeking a NATO partnership plan, which is often seen as a kind of preparation for full NATO membership. The Russians vigorously objected. Angela Merkel and the French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, said no, but under American pressure, Merkel and Sarkozy basically agreed to a resolution at the Bucharest summit, basically saying that Ukraine and Georgia would be in NATO one day. Putin was present in Bucharest. I remember how angry he was, and clearly he went back to Moscow. And I suspect from that moment on, he probably felt that war or conflict of some kind in Ukraine was inevitable, in which, by the way, he proved to be right. Anyway, that is one of the root causes of the war that the Russians talk about. But another of the root causes of the war is the various discriminatory actions that the Russians say the Ukrainian government is taking against Russian speakers. Now, this is an extraordinary issue, especially for me, because there is no doubt that these discriminatory practices in Ukraine really are taking place. There has been a consistent campaign since the Maidan events of 2014 to basically remove the Russian language from any place in Ukrainian society. I'm not saying that those efforts, by the way, have been at all successful. Certainly Russian isn't used in official texts anymore, and all Ukrainian politicians, including Zelensky, speak in Ukrainian now, even though in Zelensky's case, Russian is his native language, and I've heard it said that he doesn't actually always speak Ukrainian particularly well. Well, I'm no judge of that. I don't speak Ukrainian, so I can't say. But anyway, there's been certainly attempts to limit the use of Russian. I understand there's been a systematic attempt to reduce or limit or even extinguish the teaching of Russian, certainly in Ukrainian schools, and of course teaching in Russian in Ukrainian universities. And, well, there's also been a systematic campaign to eliminate all physical remnants of the Russian presence, or of what the Ukrainians call the Russian presence on Ukrainian territory. And I'm not going to discuss this in any great detail, but statues of Pushkin that were built in various cities have been pulled down. The Ukrainians say that these are symbols of the colonial, imperial Russian past. That's their justification, but it's hardly surprising if the Russians object, and it seems that many local people object as well. Anyway, this has been one other thing that the Russians have spoken about. They also speak about the fact that there has been a systematic attempt by the Ukrainian government to basically liquidate the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, an issue which I personally find very, very painful, and I don't want to talk about on this program. So there isn't really any issue about this. It's not one that gets discussed much in the West. Some people in Donald Trump's administration have expressed concern and alarm about this, and have made clear that they don't approve of many of these practices. In the United States, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has spoken out against this. But if we're talking about Britain, for example, what has been going on in this regard in Ukraine has hardly been reported. And when it is reported, for example, in articles that I've read in The Guardian, a supposedly left-of-centre newspaper, well, it tends to get reported with words of approval. Just saying. Anyway, there it is. The Russians object to that. They want all that reversed. They want the existence of the various elements in Ukrainian society that have been agitating to do these things. The followers of Bandera, the ultra-nationalist forces, they want them to be suppressed as well. They've been quite clear about that. And that's what the Russians mean collectively by the root causes of the conflict. Undoubtedly also, if we start going into the question of the root causes of the conflict as the Russians want, it's difficult to see how that can prevent a discussion of the events of February 2014, the seizure of power by the nationalist forces that took place then, the overthrow of President Yanukovych of Ukraine, the unconstitutional overthrow of President Yanukovych of Ukraine, and all that. Well, this is what the Russians want apparently to add to the American draft resolution. Now, I read reports, I think it was in the Financial Times, which suggested that the United States might not object to an amendment along those lines proposed by Russia. Now, I am not sure that this is true, and in fact, I rather doubt it. I think even this American administration, which is quite obviously looking to improve relations with Russia, to normalize relations with Russia, I think they would be very wary of amending a draft resolution on a topic like the conflict in Ukraine to introduce a Russian form of words into the resolution. We must be very careful about the huge amount of false information that is being spread, especially about the actions of the Trump administration. A couple of days ago, as I said, there were all those reports circulating all over the media in the West that Donald Trump was planning to go to the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow on May the 9th, where he would have met with Putin and President Xi Jinping of China. I said that I couldn't believe that that was really Donald Trump's intention, and it took his outright denial, finally, to scotch that. So I suspect that this story, that the Americans are actually looking on favourably to the Russian amendment, I suspect that this is just mischief making by someone. But anyway, we'll see what happens. Whatever, put that all aside. In these two most public fora, the United Nations, the General Assembly, the place where the entire world community comes together, we see a display of division. The Western powers openly quarrelling with each other on the topic of Ukraine. And, well, at the G7, the West's own club, its Politburo, if you like, the place where all the Western leaders meet and supposedly decide on policy, we see signs of division there. And of course, the extraordinary thing is that it is the Europeans who seem to be taking the initiative in these various moves. The Europeans complain angrily about American actions that are splitting the Western alliance, but then they continue to back resolutions at the G7 and at the United Nations, which they must know the Americans would agree to. Again, the sensible thing, in my opinion, for the European states to do would be to back the American resolution at the UN General Assembly, forget about the resolution at the G7, and if they want to say things supportive of Ukraine and President Zelensky, well, nothing prevents them doing so. The European states, who are, by the way, holding yet another meeting, I believe, today, are perfectly at liberty, if they choose, to go ahead and put out a further statement supporting Ukraine, talking about Russian aggression, doing all of those things. But trying to maneuver the United States, the leader of the Western Alliance, trying to pressure the US president in that sort of way, trying to get him to change the policy that he has already decided upon, and in which, by the way, he is supported by the entire American government. Well, that really doesn't make any kind of sense to me. I would have thought that if the European countries, the British, the French, want to create a rift between themselves and Washington, well, they're going about it in the right way. Now, maybe you will say that a rift between Europe and the United States is no bad thing. There is a school of thought, one I happen to share, that the Europeans have become ridiculously over-subservient to the Americans over the last 30 years, that they've embraced all sorts of policies that really were not in their interests to keep the Americans happy. But given that that has been their stance, that they should break with the Americans on this issue of all issues, when, to repeat again, all the Americans are doing at the moment is talking to the Russians and discussing appointment of high representatives by the United States and Russia to meet and discuss Ukraine in order to persuade the Ukrainians and the Russians to come together at the negotiating table, something that the Russians have said they would happily do, but something which, as we will see, the Ukrainians are not happy to do. Well, given all this, I really do wonder why European governments think this public quarrel with the Americans is worth the trouble. To be absolutely clear, at the United Nations, the overwhelming weight of world opinion, the Arab states, the African states, the Latin American states, the East Asian states, China, India, all the great other powers, they will support the Americans on this one. If the American resolution is presented, it will probably carry. Just to say, the Russians, even if they don't get their amendment, are quite likely to vote for it or perhaps abstain. And I would not be surprised if the American resolution, if it is drafted in the way that is said, I expect it to carry. In which case, it will be the Europeans who will presumably, at that point, abstain on voting for the American resolution, who will be isolated, who will appear the warmongers, the people who want to prolong the war, who will, in other words, be seen to be out of step with world opinion, not the Americans. Again, why the European leaders would want that, why they would want to isolate themselves in this way, I am again completely at a loss to understand. Anyway, the voting is supposed to take place later today at the General Assembly. We will see what happens. Maybe both drafts will be withdrawn and there will be no vote at all. That's one possibility. Or maybe the Americans will push ahead and present their resolution, in which case, as I said, I expect it to pass. Maybe we will have both resolutions presented, in which case I guarantee that the European one will fail, with the United States perhaps abstaining on it in any way, in any event, refusing to support it. So anyway, there we go. A show of division on the part of the European and Western powers. By contrast, the other side, if I can call it that, has just put on a display of unity. And here I'm talking about the China-Russia strategic partnership. Yesterday, Putin and Xi Jinping spoke over the telephone, and both countries, both China and Russia, have provided readouts. And the first thing to say is that there's no doubt that Xi Jinping and Putin speak very often on the telephone, but it is relatively rare for either the Kremlin or the Chinese Foreign Ministry to provide readouts of their calls. Suffice to say that the two leaders, the readouts published by both countries, say that the two leaders spoke again very warmly about the strategic partnership that exists between them, that the relationship, I'm taking this from the Russian readout, that the relationship is moving forward, that the intention is development of the comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation between the two countries. Apparently there was a discussion on ways to expand mutually beneficial cooperation in the economy, trade, investment, culture, education and sports. And we read that the conversation was held this is all from the Russian readout, in a warm and friendly atmosphere, that the two leaders emphasized that the Russian-Chinese political ties are an essential stabilizing factor in global affairs. The relationship is strategic in nature, not subject to political bias and not aimed by anyone. The Russians also say that the two leaders agreed the schedule of their upcoming meetings. The Russian readout doesn't exactly confirm this, but it seems that Xi Jinping is coming to Moscow to attend the Victory Day celebrations on the 9th of May. There will be a further meeting between them at the upcoming summit meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they will also meet in Beijing in September, when they will jointly celebrate the 80th anniversary of victory over Japan at the end of the Second World War. So they've reasserted their friendship. But of course they also discussed Ukraine. And this is what the Russian readout says about the discussion that they had about Ukraine. Vladimir Putin informed his counterpart about the recent Russian-American contacts. The president of China expressed his support for the dialogue between Russia and the United States, as well as China's readiness to help find ways to settle the Ukrainian conflict peacefully. Now, I've taken most of my reading up to this point from the Russian readout, because it is so much shorter. The Chinese readouts tend to be very informative, but also very long. And this readout, the readout that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has just published after this call, is not only very long, but it betrays some haste in its publication, because very unusually it contains what appear to be translation errors, such as references to Xi Jinping in the first person. Just saying. But anyway, essentially, it's the same readout. It's the Chinese and the Russians are saying exactly the same thing, that the relationship between their countries is friendly and strong, that they're moving forward confidently with each other, and all that. And then this is what the Chinese say about the part of the conversation, what I suspect was the most important part of the conversation, which is the part that touches on relations between Russia and the United States and about the war in Ukraine. President Putin provided an update on the latest interactions between Russia and the United States and on Russia's principled position on the Ukraine crisis. Now, it is, again, an interesting form of words that the Chinese say that the Russian position is a principled one. It's not quite saying that China agrees with the Russian position, but it comes close to doing so. And then we go on to read, Putin said that Russia is committed to removing the root causes of the conflict and reaching a sustainable and long-term peace plan. Now, this is again a reference to root causes. The Chinese are very careful to say that this is what Putin said, not what they are saying. They always insist, the Chinese always insist that they are at one remove from the conflict. But, again, by highlighting the fact that Putin spoke about the need to remove the root causes of the conflict, which of course I've just discussed, the Chinese, again, are coming very close to endorsing that. And then we get the rest of the readout, which says, President Xi noted that soon after the full escalation of the Ukraine crisis, he had outlined China's basic position, including 4 points about what must be done to address the crisis. Last September, China and Brazil, together with other global South countries, launched the group of Friends for Peace to foster the atmosphere and condition for the political settlement of the crisis. China welcomes positive efforts made by Russia and relevant parties to resolve the crisis. So, the Russians and the Chinese engaging in a show of unity, even as the Western powers fall apart. Now, all of this has happened directly after what I have to say I thought was perhaps the single most disastrous press conference that President Zelensky has ever given. I think it was one that went beyond even the catastrophic press conference that he gave last week, the one which provoked Donald Trump to call him a dictator. Now, this press conference, this latest press conference that Zelensky gave, was one press conference and speech, I should say, conducted in the context of Ukrainian commemorations of the start of the special military operation. Zelensky himself was not the only speaker. There were other speakers as well, including his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, the person that many people in Ukraine and outside consider to be the true power in Ukraine. Well, that may be, or perhaps not, who knows. And also General Syrskyi, the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, also spoke at this session. But it was Zelensky who said what you might call them the most interesting things, the most incredible things. First of all, I would like to correct a misconception that is floating around large parts of the internet. Zelensky did not offer to resign in return for peace for Ukraine. This is a misunderstanding. He said he would resign if Ukraine was granted full NATO membership and full EU membership. In other words, he is still demanding, despite the fact that the United States has ruled out membership, NATO membership for Ukraine, and in spite of the fact that the Russians have said that not only is this a red line for them, but it was the key issue at the start of the war. Well, despite all of that, Zelensky is again putting on a show of defiance. He is saying that he still wants Ukraine to be a part of both NATO and of the EU. So that was one thing Zelensky said. He also said that in order for there to be peace, in order for there to be negotiations, Ukraine needs massive security guarantees. It needs an army of 800,000 men. It needs unlimited funding and vast weapons supplies to keep this force of 800,000 men operational. And of course, it also wants European military contingents, or at least Western military contingents, stationed on its territory. Now, these are impossible, fantastic demands. They are demands which the United States has effectively already rejected. It has already made it clear. Pete Hegseth has just done so again. He did so in another speech, that the United States is not prepared to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. It's not prepared to participate in the conflict. It is not, in consequence of this, prepared to give Ukraine the kind of security guarantees that Ukraine is talking about. And, well, the Europeans can do what they like, but this is not something that the United States wants to become involved in. And here we see Zelensky going back against all of that. He wants all of the things that he has been demanding and insisting upon now for months, basically ever since his famous summer 2023 offensive collapsed in total failure. He wants NATO membership, he wants EU membership, he wants unlimited supplies of weapons. He wants all of those things, even though the Americans have already made it clear that they are not going to give them to him. And, well, he also disputed the whole question of whether Ukraine owes any money to the United States at all. The Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, has come forward and said that he wants some return for the massive investment of funds that the United States has made in Ukraine. Now, Donald Trump has come up with different numbers for this. He's talked about $350 billion. More recently, he's spoken about $500 billion. I think these figures are not that far from the truth, by the way, given how much cost Ukraine, how great the cost of Ukraine has been. Bear in mind that there was a recent article in the Daily Telegraph that I've spoken about, which estimated that the aggregate cost to Britain of the first 2 years of the special military operation, not direct cost in terms of money transferred to Ukraine, which is only $12 billion, money and weapon supplies transferred to Ukraine, which is only $12 billion, but the economic cost to Britain of the war in the first 2 years. Well, this article guesstimated it, and it made it clear that this is only an estimate. It didn't say that this is the exact number. It guesstimated it at about £80 billion. Well, if that's true, if that was the economic cost of the war to Britain, of the 2 first years of the war, 2022, 2023, given that the American economy is so much bigger than Britain's, could it be that $500 billion does approximate to the cost, the total economic cost of the war to the United States? Not just the value of the weapons transferred, or the value of the money transferred, or the loans, some of them laundered through third parties, just saying, like the IMF and the World Bank and all that. But the total economic cost of the war it might be somewhere in the region of $500 billion. That doesn't seem to me to be an impossible sum. Anyway, Zelensky threw that all back in Donald Trump's face. And he's quoted as saying this: "I know that we received $100 billion, and this is a fact. I'm not going to recognize $500 billion. With all due respect to the partners, I cannot even record $100 billion. He's absolutely right, because he's already admitted that of the $175 billion that he at one point admitted that Ukraine had received, he says that $100 billion cannot be accounted for. I cannot even record $100 billion. We cannot recognize grants as debts. I agree with former President Biden. I agreed with Congress. Both sides were present. You might not like it, but this was the agreement. It was a grant. We don't recognize this as a debt." And he again spoke in a hostile way about the mineral deal, and said that he's not prepared to sign a new agreement which has no relation to the assistance with Ukraine, which has already been provided, and which does not provide Ukraine with security guarantees from the United States. So he appears to be slamming the door on the entire idea of an agreement on strategic minerals, on the United States obtaining minerals from Ukraine. Now, he might actually be right in some of the things that he says. I have not followed with minute detail all the complicated transfers of funds that the United States has made to Ukraine over the tangled history of the special military operation. I can entirely believe that some of the money, or most of the money, or perhaps all of the money that the Americans transferred to Ukraine was given away. But why does Zelensky think that reminding Donald Trump of that, given how Donald Trump thinks that it was an unbelievably bad idea to give Ukraine all that money, why does Zelensky think it is a good idea to remind Donald Trump of that now? Isn't this far more likely to infuriate Donald Trump? Isn't this something that's going to make him extremely angry? Isn't it further proof of that grotesque sense of entitlement that Zelensky has, which Donald Trump has repeatedly spoken about, and which was also touched on by Marco Rubio in a recent interview? Why go out of one's way to bring this all up in that sort of way? Now, Donald Trump last week said that when the US Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bassent, arrived in Kiev, and there was a discussion with Zelensky about the mineral deal, the Ukrainians treated Mr. Bassent very rudely. That was Donald Trump's words. Now, Donald Trump uses words sometimes in a rather scattergun way. I didn't take that especially seriously when I first read it. But then, this morning, I read in the Daily Telegraph in London information apparently obtained from Ukrainian sources that over the course of the discussions between Bassent and Zelensky over the mineral deal, Zelensky got furiously angry. There were raised voices. Well, I've heard stories about Ukraine screaming at his generals. I'd even discussed that in a previous program. I remember that Ukraine basically lost his temper and shouted at the Treasury Secretary of the United States, the man who must sign the checks which Zelensky wants to cash. Well, there we go. Again, further examples of Zelensky's grotesque, overweening sense of entitlement and his complete failure to understand or to listen to what the Americans have been saying. And it's not just Zelensky. His chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, also made comments at this same event in which he appeared to rule out any territorial concessions at all to the Russians. Pete Hegseth, the US Defense Secretary, has already clearly said that it is unrealistic for Ukraine to imagine that it can recover its former territories. But Yermak, well, he insists that they must be recovered. Again, showing, I would have thought, open defiance of the United States. Now, I haven't seen Syrski's comments at this event, but I have heard accounts of them. I gather that they were far more downbeat than these frankly defiant and even provocative statements from Zelensky and Yermak. And apparently Syrsky spoke about a very difficult and tense situation on the front lines, though, as he always does, he tried to make out that the situation was still under control, which, by the way, it isn't. But listening to all of this, listening to what Zelensky and Yermak was saying, it really does make one wonder exactly what the strategy that the Ukrainians have in fact is. Well, I'm going to make a suggestion. Emmanuel Macron is currently, I believe, in Washington. He's due to meet with Donald Trump soon. Apparently, he's going to try to persuade Donald Trump to include the Europeans and the Ukrainians in future negotiations about Ukraine. Now, this is a complete misunderstanding. It's, by the way, it's not a misunderstanding, it's a misrepresentation of the nature of the discussions that the Americans and the Ukrainian and the Russians are currently conducting with each other. The Americans and the Russians are not currently bargaining about Ukraine. They're not talking about where the ceasefire lines should be, or when a ceasefire should be imposed, or any of those things. The Americans, and they made this very clear, Mike Waltz talked about this again, are seeking to normalize relations with Russia, which does not mean, by the way, partnership with Russia or alliance with Russia. I read an extraordinary article by Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times, which all but treats Trump's United States as being preparing itself to ally with Russia against Europe. I mean, these are absurd things. What this seeks to do is to re-establish dialogue, to start getting diplomacy between the United States and Russia, communication between two nuclear superpowers functioning again. That might eventually lead to the lifting of sanctions, especially if some way can be found to resolve this issue in Ukraine. But the Americans have many things that they need to talk about to the Russians, and they don't need the Europeans hanging around to do it for them. It's absurd. This is a demand that the Europeans gatecrash discussions between the Americans and the Russians. In effect, not gatecrash, but acquire some sort of veto power over those discussions, the fact of the holding of those discussions, which is absurd and which I cannot imagine that the Americans are going to concede. But if we come back to the topic of Ukraine, obviously the Americans have made it very clear that they want this problem resolved. They need to have this problem resolved because whilst it is still there, full normalization of relations between Russia and the United States cannot take place. And since achieving that level of normalization is an American priority, the Americans want the conflict resolved. But the Americans have always made it clear that the way to resolve the conflict is through direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Now, what Zelensky and Yermak have been up to is they've been setting terms and conditions in advance of those negotiations, which guarantee that the negotiations are going to fail. And I cannot believe that the French and the British don't know this. And what they're trying to do when they go to Washington, Macron is already there. Starmer is apparently due to travel to Washington on Thursday. That what they're really trying to do is to lend support to Zelensky. Zelensky is uttering all of these defiant words. He's probably been encouraged to do this by the Europeans, at least to some degree, so that the Europeans can come to Washington and he can say that this is Zelensky's position, this is Ukraine's position. Either you fundamentally change your behavior, either you come round to our thinking in Europe and Zelensky's thinking in Europe, because Zelensky isn't going to back down, or you're not going to get peace in Ukraine. You are going to get a military defeat in Ukraine for which you, Donald Trump, will be blamed. And there have been articles in the British media saying that Keir Starmer, when he goes to meet with Trump on Thursday, is going to say essentially the same thing. It's packaged. The media packages it as trying to flatter Donald Trump's ego, telling Donald Trump, do you really want to be the person who allows Ukraine to go down to defeat? Or would you rather instead work with us? We, of course, agree with some sort of a negotiation process, but we don't like the way you're doing it. We don't like the fact that you're talking to the Russians without us. You must work in harness with us, which of course would mean, given the stance the European states are taking, that there would in reality be no negotiations, or rather, to be more precise, contacts between the Russians and the Americans at all. And of course, you must also endorse the deployment of these reassurance forces to Ukraine, the European contingents that Emperor Macron and Field Marshal Starmer proposed to send to Ukraine, all 30,000 men of them. They want to send them to Ukraine, and as I've discussed already, even if they say now that that will happen only if the Russians agree as part of a negotiation, something which, by the way, is impossible. Given the other things that they have been saying, given what Zelensky has just been saying, is it so difficult to imagine that Starmer and Zelensky could come to an agreement directly with each other to deploy British and French troops to Ukraine, even if the Russians don't agree, and then the British and the French will turn round and say to the Americans, well, you agree to go along with our perspective of the conflict. You see how unreasonable the Russians are. We are now there, and you must protect us, because if you don't, NATO, the whole Western alliance, will collapse. Now, I don't think that the Americans are going to be fooled. I don't think they're taken in by any of this. Steve Witkoff has now given a most interesting interview. In fact, one of the most interesting interviews that I've seen up to now involving US officials about the conflict in Ukraine. He said that in 2022, peace in Ukraine came very, very close. And of course, he's referring to the Istanbul Agreement. He is, of course, absolutely right. And he is saying that the agreements that were reached in Istanbul should be basically the starting point of future discussions. Now, that is very interesting because it brings the United States closer again to Putin's position, the one that he outlined to the Russian Foreign Ministry in June 2024, when he outlined what I have since referred to as Istanbul Plus. Just saying. So it seems to me, and we see this from this argument over resolutions at the General Assembly and at the G7, that the Americans understand perfectly well what the Europeans are up to, and they're not going to be pulled along by the nose, and they're probably going to just tell the Europeans, well, we understand what you want to do. If you want to sort out your own arrangements with the Ukrainians, that's up to you, but we are not going to provide a backstop. We are not going to give a guarantee. If you go ahead with all of this, then you are on your own, in which case, of course, these deployments won't happen. There is, by the way, a groundswell of criticism against these ideas of deploying these forces in Britain. The former British Prime Minister Theresa May's advisor, Nick Timothy, has just written a piece in the Daily Telegraph, for example, criticising that idea. And I've already spoken about how other articles, which have also appeared in the British media, basically go out of their way to say that this idea is unworkable and indeed absurd. But of course, it's not just these maneuvers by Zelensky and Yermak and by the Europeans. And as I said, I do suspect that there is an element of coordination. That these maneuvers are not just intended to shape the settlement, to try to drag the Americans away from their quest for normalization with the Russians and for real negotiations with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, to try and achieve peace there. Rather, they're also intended to prepare the ground for the eventual Ukrainian defeat. Now, there's been an absolutely astonishing article today in the Daily Telegraph, which is about the situation on the front lines in Ukraine. And it talks in particular about the battle for Toretsk. And the article, its title is "The City That Putin Couldn't Take." And of course it refers to Toretsk. And the entire article is written on the premise that the battle for Toretsk is still underway, that the Ukrainians are heroically and successfully defending Toretsk, that the Russians, yes, they have achieved some advances, but they've achieved those advances through human wave tactics, through total indifference to human life, all the usual stereotypes that are always trotted out, by the way, about the Russian army in whatever war it fights. That the Russians have suffered hundreds of thousands of losses, more losses in 2024 than in 2022, 2023 combined. That Ukraine, in other words, is in actually pretty good shape, that it's holding back the Russian horde, and that if there is a negotiation now, and if Ukraine is forced into some capitulation process. Well, this is all ultimately the fault of Donald Trump and of the Americans, who have not understood the realities, the true realities of the war. Now, to my certain knowledge, the Russians captured Toretsk about 3 weeks ago, back in January. Any claim that there is still fighting going on in Toretsk itself is certainly wrong. There is fighting going on in some of the villages near to Toretsk, but the Russians appear to be clearing those villages. For all I know, every so often maybe a Ukrainian reconnaissance group enters the largely deserted ruins of Toretsk now. I don't think this is, in any meaningful sense, a case of any fighting going on in Toretsk, or suggests that the battle for Toretsk is still underway. So this article is pure fiction. Now, I am sure that the journalists who wrote this article wrote it in good faith. None of them seems to have gone to Toretsk. They were reporting from a distance. They were talking to Ukrainian officials and military officers and journalists and other people like that. They were shown banks of screens with drones flying, all very difficult to understand, of course, and not at all difficult to give people a particular impression of what's going on. Every day, by the way, if you follow the war, you will see footage of drones colliding into tanks and armoured vehicles, and you see bangs going on and sometimes vehicles exploding. You also, unfortunately, if you watch the videos regularly, you will see on many days, not on every day, pictures of drones killing soldiers on either side. But it's important, I think, to remember that at any point in the conflict, in this battle, there are only so many drones operating, only so many FPV drones in particular, because those are the drones that people are talking about. And, we're talking about hundreds of drones across the battlefield on any particular day. Most of those drones, of course, won't actually hit anything. Only a small proportion of those will. And this is taking place against a backdrop of an army of a war in which the Russian army is said to number 800,000 men, and the Ukrainian army, well, according to Zelensky, it could be anything up to 1 million men, though most think that the actual Ukrainian forces on the battle lines number around 250,000. Drones undoubtedly account for a significant number of the men who are killed on each side, and they exact a price every single day. But it can be very easy to think that drones are flying and killing people all over the contact line in huge numbers every day, if one takes one's understanding of the conflict purely from the footage. Whereas, of course, the total footage released by each side on any particular day, which shows successful drone attacks, will only cover a very, very, very small part of the total operations. And if we're talking about drone attacks on armoured vehicles, I've received reports which I am confident are true, that in 90% of cases, the damage that is done by the drones to the armoured vehicles is superficial, and that once the vehicles are brought back to the workshops, they can usually be repaired fairly quickly. So they might be knocked out, they might not be able to participate further in the fighting if a drone collides with them. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people inside them have been killed, or all of them have been killed, and the machines, particularly the heavy tracked armoured vehicles, the infantry fighting vehicles and the tanks, can be repaired quite quickly. On the Ukrainian side, in terms of damage to the Ukrainians, I think that there is, by the way, an element of confusion, because all drones now, I've noticed, that are being used in Ukraine are invariably referred to as FPV drones. Whereas I am sure that most of the drones that the Russians used to destroy armoured vehicles across Ukraine are still bigger drones like the Lancet. Just saying. Anyway, put all this aside. This story that the Daily Telegraph has come up with is clearly intended to reinforce this narrative of the stab in the back which is coming. The idea that the Russians cannot win the war, that, they failed to capture Kiev within 3 days. They never said they had any plan to do that. In fact, on the very first day of the special military operation, I remember Vladimir Putin telling the Azerbaijani leader, Mr. Aliyev, that in fact he had no plans to occupy the whole of Ukraine. He was seeking the fulfillment of the aims of the special military operation, which were far more limited than that, and he was open to doing that by negotiation. And in fact, we know, it is a recorded and historical fact, that a Russian official, on Putin's instructions, Dmitry Kozak, telephoned the Ukrainians on the day that the special military operation began and suggested talks. And in fact, the Russians and the Ukrainians did hold talks throughout the first weeks of the special military operation. And as Stephen Witkoff has helpfully reminded us, they seemed to come to agreement in Istanbul with the text of an agreement initialed by both sides. But, well, put all that aside, repeat the fantasy about occupying Kiev within 3 days, trot out the stories about the resistance of Ukraine, the failures of the Russian army, and pretend that even now, as Ukraine's situation becomes ever more catastrophic, if Ukraine loses the war or is forced into some unsatisfactory peace, that this is the fault of Donald Trump, rather than the actual realities on the battlefield. And here I am going to again have to say something about those realities. I'm not going to spend too much time doing it in this program. But briefly, the Russians continue their advances right across the entire contact line. There is now drone footage which conclusively confirms that the Russians are indeed in Lebedeva, the village northeast of Svedlikovo in Sudzha region. They seem to be also advancing in the area of Plekhovo, the village to the south of Sudzha. They appear to be marching westwards. The Russians are claiming that the center of gravity of the battle in this area is moving out of Kursk region, south into Sumy region. But there is very little information about this. And I know that this is disputed in some places, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But the fact is that one way or the other, there's no doubt anybody who can look at a map can see that Ukrainian forces in Sudzha, in Kursk region, are now in a salient. They are at risk of becoming trapped, and that the pincers, the trap around them, is closing. And there is a real risk that it will indeed close, not because the Ukrainian troops in Suja, in Kursk region, don't still have time and opportunity to retreat, but because Zelensky has now made it a matter of prestige that Ukraine must hold on to its territory, the territory it controls in Kursk region. He said that this territory is essential because it's part of a land swap that he wants to negotiate with Russia. A preposterous idea in itself, but as I discussed in another program, that basically dooms the Ukrainian troops to remain in Suja, to remain in Kursk region, come what may, with a very high probability now that they will get trapped. So that's Kursk region. Now, there's been a lot of further information about fighting in the northern area of the Oskol River. The Russians have now confirmed that they have indeed captured this village or this community of Topoli near the border with Russia at the very northern end of the Oskol River. I'm not clear about the significance of this, but they have apparently continued to enlarge their bridgehead, and they have apparently also made further progress in the area of Chasov Yar. There's a whole area of Chasov Yar that has apparently fallen under their control, and there's a rather astonishing drone footage of Russian troops on motorbikes pelting down a main road. You can see the explosions happening all around them, but that doesn't seem to deter or frighten them, and they push on down this road, and it seems that they have managed to capture whole positions, a whole new set of positions, somewhere to the southeast of Chasov Yar. And again, I'm not going to discuss at length the nature of the battle there. Some of the most interesting news over the last couple of hours has, however, come from the Siversk area. Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, of the Russian General Staff, visited this area recently. He spoke to the local commanding officer, who is General Sanchik, and we've now got further confirmation that the village of Belogorovka is fully under Russian control, and it is now apparently fully acknowledged that the Russians controlled the big slag heap next to Belogorovka. Now, the Russians and the Ukrainians have been fighting over Belogorovka for years. The Russians captured Belogorovka in 2022. The Ukrainians then recaptured it. Then the Russians claimed to have captured it early last year. Then there were reports that they'd captured the slag heap. Then it appeared that they hadn't captured the slag heap. Then the Ukrainians re-established, or perhaps they were never fully pushed out of parts of Belogorovka, but it's now clear that this whole territory is fully under Russian control, and apparently conclusively so. The Russians also undoubtedly have maintained their presence in the village of Verkhokamyanska, which lies somewhat to the west and is just located just east of Siversk, and apparently they control the hill north of Verkhokamyanska. My own sense is that the Russians have never committed significant forces until now to this part of the battlefront. But it seems as if they now have, and they have a commander, General Sanchik, who is apparently experienced and proficient in these sort of operations. It looks as if the Russians have finally decided that the time has come to bring the battle for Siversk to an end, much as they made the decision back in September, October, to bring the battle for Ugledar to an end. So it's likely that at some point in the next few weeks, Siversk also will fall. And elsewhere, the Russian advances also continue. The Russians continue to advance towards the Dnieper. Apparently, they've captured more of Udachnya, southwest of Pokrovsk. They've advanced westwards in the area west of Selidovo, also towards the Dnieper, and perhaps the most rapid advance by the Russians in this area is west of Velikaya Novosilka. Every day in that area, more and more settlements and communities fall under Russian control. So the Russian advance continues, and it will continue to accelerate. The Americans can see that. They can see that the war in Ukraine is lost, that the Russians are going to win. That's partly the reason why they are pulling out. This stab in the back narrative, which I can see gradually being constructed, will have no truth in it, though I fully expect that in a few months' time, in a year's time, it will hit us in full flood. Now, at this point, I want to say something about the elections which have just taken place in Germany. Now, here I'm going to say that, in my opinion, the best discussion of what has happened, and the one which corresponds most closely with mine, is a discussion that you can find on this British magazine Unheard, and it is by Wolfgang Munchau, who is of course German. Now, Wolfgang Munchau used to be a regular commentator on the Financial Times. He doesn't seem to write for the Financial Times anymore. I'm not here to discuss what the reasons for that might be. I've no reason to think that his parting from the Financial Times was anything other than amicable. But suffice to say that since he stopped writing for the Financial Times, I always thought he was a good writer, by the way, but since he stopped writing for the Financial Times, I have found the quality of his work to have improved. And he says this: Germany, this is the title of his article, Germany is in a centrist trap. The political extremes are gaining ground. I'm not sure that they are extremes, by the way. I'd say that they are the real left and the real right, but never mind. Anyway, he then goes on to say this: the CDU has just declared victory, but Germany is as lost as ever. From its dysfunctional economic model to its ineffective army and the lack of neat leadership of Europe faced with Donald Trump's onslaughts, the Federal Republic's urgent problems will not be solved by Friedrich Merz and his willing coalition. And then he discusses the results. And the key point to take about these results is that the CDU, CSU, the party, the grouping that has supposedly won the election, has had a very bad result indeed. They managed to win with 28.5% of the vote. Now that is dismal. That is the second worst result that the CDU, CSU has achieved in its history. I think it's only slightly better than the awful result that Armin Laschet got for the CDU, CSU in the disastrous election when the CDU, CSU lost in 2021. This is a dreadful result. The CDU, CSU used to be the dominant political force in the German Federal Republic. Under the long rule of Konrad Adenauer, it was of course the ruling party. It used to regularly get 40+% of the vote. Sometimes even in Angela Merkel's time, it won enough votes to obtain a majority in the Bundestag by itself without having to go into coalition with other parties. This is, as I said, an absolutely dreadful result. And Wolfgang Munchau says that there is a mood of, well, maybe not dismay within the CDU, but anyway, they're less than happy. Their combined 28.5%, they had hoped for more than 30%, makes it hard for them to claim a mandate, which is absolutely correct. Now, the other parties, the other establishment parties, the SPD, did catastrophically. Now, the SPD is Germany's oldest political party. It was created in the 19th century. For much of its early existence, it took its ideas from Karl Marx. Just saying, it was nominally a Marxist party until the 1950s. It was the biggest party, it became the biggest party in the Reichstag, the German Imperial Parliament, before the First World War. It became Germany's biggest party during the period of the Weimar Republic. It has a very, very long history, a history that basically has played a significant role in shaping modern Germany. And of course, it was the dominant party in the 1970s, in the age of Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, when it reshaped German foreign policy and embraced the policy of Ostpolitik, the rapprochement with the Soviet Union at that time, which paved the way for German reunification. And by the way, during that same period, it governed Germany well. And it was also, in those days, polling over 40% on a regular basis. And this party, the SPD, Germany's oldest party, the party that embodied the centre-left in Germany, has now crashed to 16.6%. A catastrophic result. It brings the SPD close to that point where you could perhaps say that its entire existence is under threat. So these are the two parties, the two big establishment parties in Germany, the CDU, CSU, and they've done, the CDU and CSU did dismally. Once upon a time, not so long ago, a 28.5% vote for the CDU, CSU would have been judged catastrophic. Today, it's merely seen as extremely bad. And a vote of 16.6% for the SPD is indeed catastrophic. Now, these are the two parties which are now going to form a grand coalition with each other. Friedrich Merz will, of course, become the Chancellor. He will lead the CDU, CSU, which has impressed no one in Germany. Friedrich Merz has impressed few people in Germany as the prospective Chancellor. And he will govern in coalition with the SPD, which is the party that has just gone down to its worst ever defeat, which is completely discredited in Germany. It is a recipe for a failed government. It's a recreation of a grand coalition of the CDU, CSU and the SPD, which was tried many times by Angela Merkel. Wolfgang Munchau points out that she governed with such a grand coalition 3 times. And as Wolfgang Munchau correctly says, there was nothing grand about it. It was a coalition of failure. It failed to address the causes of deindustrialization, and it failed to meet NATO defense spending targets. It cozied up to Putin and approved the Baltic Sea gas pipelines, which, as far as I'm concerned, were its one achievement, which has now been completely erased. It failed to resolve the Eurozone's economic crisis, and it supported the immigration policies which gave rise ultimately to the rise of the AfD. This same coalition is now back in the driving seat, albeit under new leadership. And it's fascinating to see which parties have won or gained support. Firstly, the AfD has gained support. It's now polling at just under 21%. I'd seen private polls which put it higher. I suspect that earlier in the election it probably was polling a bit higher. I now have come round to the view that Friedrich Merz's extraordinary political manoeuvre, where he embraced some parts of the AfD's immigration policies and put them to the vote in the Bundestag, that was perhaps provoked by really alarming private polling, that there was an increasing drift of voters from the CDU, CSU to the AfD. It may have stopped that drift and brought back some people to the CDU, CSU. But nonetheless, despite that, the AfD has still managed to poll just under 21% of the vote. It is the only party in Germany that is confidently growing and which looks positioned, potentially, to form a government. It is just 7 points behind the CDU, CSU, which would once upon a time have been thought impossible, and it is bigger than the SPD, Germany's oldest party, the established party of the centre-left. Now, on the left, there's also been some very extraordinary developments. The first is to say that there's been an extraordinary revival of Die Linke. Die Linke, I should say, is the old East German Communist Party. About 10 years ago, it forged an alliance with the dissident left-wing politician, SPD politician Oskar Lafontaine, and it recreated itself as Die Linke, but it then it increasingly lost its way, its vote began to fall, and of course, about a year ago, Sarah Wagenknecht split away and set up a party of her own, separate from Die Linke, and it looked at that point as if Die Linke was doomed. Well, what happened is that over the course of this election, Die Linke somehow re-energized. It installed a new photogenic leader. It received a great deal of publicity. It managed to win back some support from Sarah Wagenknecht's group, and it ran a very effective campaign on social media and appears to have won the largest amount of support. It's now the first party amongst young Germans aged between 18 and 24, which is quite a remarkable comeback for this party. I ought to say, I think this is a fragile win, but again, it demonstrates the extent of the disenchantment of young people in Germany, of many people in Germany, with the established parties. It seems that a lot of the young people who voted for Die Linke, or at least some of them, had previously been supporters of the Greens, who also suffered a certain loss of support. So that apparently means that Die Linke is now, as I said, a significant political force in German politics. It's not far from challenging the Greens. And the Greens, I believe, came out with about 11% of the vote. And here is perhaps where the intrigue comes, because Sarah Wagenknecht just failed to get her party over the line and into the Bundestag. She won 44.97% of the vote, 0.3% less than she would have needed to get representation in the Bundestag. I gather that the difference was 13,000 votes. She is complaining that these were votes of Germans abroad, and she's suggesting that there might have been some issues with that. I'm not in a position to say. What I will say is this: if Sarah Wagenknecht had got those 13,000 votes, if her party had managed to get into the Bundestag, then the SPD, the CDU and the CSU would not have had enough support to form a grand coalition with a majority, which would have been extraordinary. And they would have had to rely on the support of the Greens. Now, this is an appalling outcome altogether. By the way, the other big establishment party, the Free Democrats, crashed. They are also out of the parliament as well. I believe they fell to about 4.3%. In Sarah Wagenknecht's case, I would say this is a new party. It's not been around for very long. It's only got, it's not yet fully established its organisation. It needs work to do. I would not be surprised if he comes back and re-enters the Bundestag in the next election, whenever that is. But the point is, we're going to get another centrist party, exactly as centrist government, exactly as Wolfgang Munchau says. A government of losers, a government of two mainstream parties, the CDU-CSU and the SPD, that are clearly in decline. A coalition that has no ideas about how to really change Germany's direction, and which, by the way, lacks the majority in the Bundestag to remove the debt brake, which has been talked about so much, the constitutional limit on spending. In order to do that, even if the SPD and the CDU could agree on that, they would need the support of Die Linke to do it. They might get it, by the way. As I said, I'm personally skeptical about how radical Die Linke really is. But anyway, there we go. I mean, it's a government, a coalition of losers, a coalition without ideas, led by a new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who looks less impressive by the day. He is the person, a political leader, who has made his entire career insisting on the Atlanticist project, the alliance with the United States. He's now making comments about the need for Europe to achieve independence from the United States. He talks about the fact that NATO might collapse as soon as June, by June this year, which does seem extraordinary, even for me. What is he going to do about any of these things? What can he do about any of these things? Germany, again, remains trapped in the same centrist system that it's been trapped in for, well, at least 2 decades. I'm going to say this, despite some claims that this election was a repudiation of Merkelism, it seems to me that Merkelism still prevails. It's still government by the centre, except now it's the exhausted and discredited centre, not the self-confident centre that it was in Merkel's day. Anyway, there we are. Don't expect anything new from Germany. Don't expect any change. The British and the French will still basically make their moves over Ukraine. I don't think the Germans will do anything particularly different. They might send the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. If they do, the Americans will not be happy. And I'm not sure, by the way, that the Taurus missiles can do very much if the Americans do not provide the satellite data that would be needed to operate them at any degree of proper range. So, a government of losers in Germany and defiance of the United States by Zelensky. The day when the Americans decide that they've washed their hands, they're going to wash their hands of the whole of Project Ukraine, walk away, leave it to the Europeans to pick up the pieces, and start to distance themselves from Europe, is growing closer. I still think that NATO has some way to go, but I think it's now living on borrowed time. If it's gone, not by June, but say in 5 or 10 years' time, I would not be at all surprised. Anyway, this is my programme for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.